Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Ann Townsend, and I'm a part of the MITRE Corporation. And I'm joined by my colleague, Michael Ekstrom, also part of the MITRE Corporation. And we're here to talk to you about data confidentiality and specific data breaches. We wanted to open up with this question for the audience to think about for your own organization. Is your organization's confidential data really confidential? Next slide, please. Another way I like to think of this question is, right now, could it be your organization sustaining a data breach? Would you know? Do you have the tools in place to really understand that it's happening or what to do about it? Michael and I have both been to RSA before, and when we spoke about data breaches before, we talked about financial impacts. At that time, we said that the average financial impact an organization sustains is $3.92 million. We're honored to be back at RSA again. We're happy to tell you that number has gone down, but unfortunately, it's only gone down by a small amount. Financial impact for 2020, the average for an organization was $3.86 million. Now, I talked a lot about in the past and now financial impacts, but I also want to bring out the idea of operational impacts and reputational impacts. So as an organization sustains a data breach, they're going to have to refocus their resources onto understanding what has happened. Can they still keep doing what they're supposed to be doing? Do they need to stop production? So there's an operational impact that's sustained by that organization, as well as when the information gets out, when there's news out there that this organization is having this data breach problem. Users, customers of that organization are going to start to maybe not trust the organization, so there's a reputational impact. So with all of this on the line, financials, operations, reputation, organizations have to start to wonder, how do I handle a data breach, or how could I stop one immediately if it was to happen? Next slide, please. So through our work at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, which is a part of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, we've approached this challenge space through the Data Security Work Program. What we've done is we focused our challenge really on the organization's data. And so data, we mean anything that an organization will want to keep confidential. So database records, system files, configuration files, anything about their customer data. These are all potential targets of data confidentiality events. If you look at my slide, I say attacks, but in hindsight, now that I'm speaking here with you, I really should be saying events. So the distinction is data confidentiality attacks. We know those as things like ransomware, spear phishing campaigns, anything with a malicious intent. But there's also this idea of honest human error. Think about your own organization. Do you think it's possible that someone within your own organization could lose their cell phone, or they could lose their laptop? While it's out of their control, are the right capabilities in place to protect that data? So our approach has been to effectively identify and protect assets against data confidentiality attacks or any type of event, as well as detailed methods that can detect, respond, and recover from data confidentiality events. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that is like the intro, the scoping. The next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to really dig into the technical content, give some great demos about what we've been doing. But I just want to let everyone here know where this data is coming from. The National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence is putting together two documents, 1800-23, which is titled Data Confidentiality, Identifying, Protecting Assets and Data Against Data Breaches. For brevity in the slides, we've abbreviated that as IDPR. And 1800-29, Data Confidentiality, Detect, Respond to, and Recover from Data Breaches, DRR. Both of these are leveraging the NIST cybersecurity framework and calling out each one of those functions as it relates to a data confidentiality event. Both of these documents, they develop architectures to really address data breaches. Each one of these documents is comprised of 3 volumes. Volume A is the executive summary. It really talks about like what are those impacts that I mentioned at the beginning, what organizations should be doing about these type of problems. Volume B is the much more technical document, and that's where a lot of the content that you're going to see in Michael's slides is coming from. It's going to talk about the capabilities that you need to have in place, the architectures that one should build, and what products that we used at the facilities in Rockville, Maryland at NCCOE to build out this lab. It also does a mapping to the cybersecurity framework so that you can understand with each capability you put in with your organization, how does that map to that framework? And then lastly, I just want to point out that all of these publications are free, they're available to the public, and they're posted on this website we have listed on this slide. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Michael to really walk through the technical components.
All right, thank you, Anne. So, as Anne mentioned, the information I'll be digging to is the sort of thing you'll find in Volume B of our documents. And I'll be going into a bit more of a deep dive on the technical recommendations, including our security architectures. Just as a note before I get into those, that these builds are currently in progress and are being built in tandem. So you'll see two architectures. This is what we expect our final architectures to look like, but as with all things currently being built, they may be subject to small changes. They're also meant to work together, and I'll talk a bit about more about that later. So, without further ado, let's dive into the architecture detailed in NIST Special Publication 1828, Identify and Protect. So, as the name would imply, we're looking at identify and protect functions of the NIST cybersecurity framework. And we're looking to cover technologies that interact with a data breach in the early stages. Ideally, we would like to stop a data breach from happening at all, and we would like to mitigate its scope and impact in the early stages. So as we look at this diagram here, I'm going to dig a little deeper into the bubbles you see. But first, a small caveat. As we build out this architecture, we can't build something, unfortunately, that is the exact fit for every single enterprise and every single industrial sector. So we try and have some of our greatest hits in our data domain and our example enterprise. And all of these security tools surround that as it's being built in the NCCOE virtual lab. So let's start with the internet. Has many problems begin, and drill our way downwards. One of the first things that your users will see reaching out to the internet, and anything coming from the internet down will interact with, is a browser isolation tool. This is actually an example of the collaborative nature of the way that NCCOE projects are built, and was the result of discussions and comments received when this project was proposed. The browser isolation technology, what it serves to do is provide a buffer between your users and the perils of the internet. So sites of potentially malicious nature, any files being downloaded are not immediately hosted upon well, they're hosted externally, but then brought down to and then just hosted on the user's machine. So any sort of potentially malicious executable or external web page content is displayed through the browser isolation, and if properly configured, can stop a wide range of attacks before they are able to happen. From there, surrounding our entire enterprise and security architecture is our network protection solution. In our case, we are employing one that exemplifies principles of zero trust networking. The intention of this is to provide kind of blanket allow listing capabilities across the entire enterprise. So to talk across the network, you have to be properly authenticated onto a system, and you have to be talking in a authorized way to another system that is also authorized. So no free-flowing anything goes on the network, depending on how strictly it is set up to protect your essential data, is going to do a lot to stop attacks from propagating around the network. From there, we're going to drill a little deeper and look at the data itself and the protections we put on it. We want to make sure that, of course, we are trying to stop data breaches, so we want robust data protection capabilities on our data. That can take multiple forms. In our case, we're, of course, looking for strong, secure encryption and proper user access to that data to make sure that it's not just your data is tightly locked away. It doesn't really matter if anyone can open the box, or if a single stolen password allows someone to unravel your entire data security scheme. So to mitigate that, we want to have strong user access controls in place, particularly around your data, but of course on the systems as well. And we'll make sure we're using multi-factor authentication as we do that to make sure that, as previously stated, a single stolen credential is not as much of a single point of failure. Now, that may seem to be enough, but it's not the full story on protecting a single block of data. For that, you also need robust data management. You need to be aware of where your data is on the system. You can have the best security on the world on one machine, but if your backups of that machine aren't similarly secure, or the information that was sent from that machine to another machine or unknowingly mirrored is not similarly protected, then it is a massive point of weakness on that data protection scheme. So it's essential to know what your important data is and where it is. We don't care as much about the lunch menus that are emailed around, but certain documents, protected information that consumers have trusted you with, those are all things we need to be aware of and make sure our protections are in place. Following that up is policy enforcement. We focus a little less on that this time as we have in our previous documents, 1825 and 26, that have been presented at RSA. But we want to at least dig a little into making sure our system integrity and system protections are up to scratch. We want to make sure that if a system is known to be on the enterprise, it's plugged into our zero trust network protection scheme. We want to make sure it's up to standards. We want to make sure that there's proper USB enforcement in place, proper authentication, patched up, good to go, everything. We want to make sure that the machines themselves that our data is resting on are not our greatest point of weakness. All of this that I've talked about is going to tie into our logging solution. This is included here because all of these actions are going to generate a lot of data that's very useful for your security team. But how are we going to use that? Well, I will talk about that with our next architecture. The architecture for detect, respond, and recover. The one that will be detailed in this special publication, 1829. This is going to describe technologies that will be most useful to have in place after an attack has begun. So we're taking it as a given that the data breach is at least partially successful. It is someone or something has gained a foothold on the system. That, or as Anne previously mentioned, there is a some sort of accidental action. And as I'm going through this, both for the previous architecture and as I'm going through this one, please, I'm happy to answer any questions in chat as we're going through this. I know it's a little bit of a breeze through. So with these technologies, we want to be aware of a data breach as it's happening. We don't want our awareness of a data breach to come from the FBI telling us that a large number of credit cards that were stolen has been correlated to your location, so you probably have a data breach 8 months ago. We don't want that to be our first line of defense and awareness. We want to have ownership and responsibility for the data that has been trusted to us. And that will tie into our breach recovery. Now, recovery for data confidentiality, as opposed to data integrity, is a much different thing to deal with. So when it comes to data integrity and an issue like ransomware, recovery is a line in the sand you can cross. You can reach a point where your data that was destroyed or corrupted has been recovered, your systems has been recovered, you trust your data, you trust your systems, your backups are all restored, you're good to go. You have recovered from an attack of that nature. Not so much for data confidentiality. You can't untell a secret, you can't ring a bell, you can't undo a data breach in that fashion, and in most cases. So instead, recovery looks a little different. What we want to do first and foremost is we want to be aware of the data breach and we want to get out in front of it. We want to know the extent of the impact, what sorts of files were affected. Was it health data? Was it social security numbers, other PII, credit card numbers? These are, depending on what was breached, who was breached, where you are, where your customers are, you're going to have very different reporting requirements. And all of that ties into your recovery from a data breach. Because not only are you trying to restore your trust in your systems and your trust in your ability to secure data, you need to convince other people to trust your systems and your ability to protect their data all over again after a data breach has occurred. As Anne described, restoring your reputation. So what technologies are going to support that goal? Once again, going down from the internet, we're going to have our data protection and user access controls detailed again, but we're going to look more this time at those logs, that information that it generates, that logging, reporting, monitoring. We want to know when a data breach happens and the scope and how we're going to stop it. All this ties into event detection. You can have the best intruder detection system in the world, maintain perfect awareness of your data, but if your security team or somebody isn't looking at that or it's not generating alerts, then it's just another footnote in a headline about a data breach saying, oh yes, they had all these systems in place, but no one looked at them, which isn't helpful for anyone, much less reputational recovery. And then that goes into mitigation, understanding the scope of a data breach and how to stop it. All of this ties into effective recovery, doing proper data breach recovery and doing it right the first time so you don't have to go back and revise which files were affected, which users were affected, and the scope of an incident. And once again, if there are, sorry, I'll go back a moment. If there are any questions regarding this architecture, happy to answer them in chat as I go into our use cases. So these things aren't just built in the NCCOE virtual laboratory and look at it, say, that's probably good enough, and move on with our day. We test these architectures. And the way we do that is through our use cases. These use cases are meant to simulate various data breach scenarios that you might see out in the wild. Throughout all of them, we seek to test various different sorts of attack vectors and means of data exfiltration. So you'll see examples of both intentional malicious action, as well as some things that could be marked up to simple carelessness, losing a laptop, that is a use case. And from looking at those scenarios, we want to dig into how we're going to respond, how our architecture is going to stack up to the challenge. So let's take a look at the first use case I'm going to discuss today, exfiltration of encrypted data. So we take it as a given in this use case that two things are true. One, you have a trusted enterprise. It is secure. Your organizational operation is going well. Your data is well protected. Everything is fine. We also assume that there is some sort of acquisition of resources. Maybe it's a new employee. Maybe you're bringing a new laptop into the system. Employees bringing their own device. Maybe there's a corporate acquisition or merger. Whatever the story may be, new assets are being brought into your perfect, uncompromised, trusted enterprise. Unfortunately, it is not the case that all of the new machines should be similarly trusted. One of the new machines has a backdoor on it that has already been put in place by an attacker and is constantly leaking data back to a malicious server. So that machine is going to be brought into the enterprise. And any time that data is generated on that workstation or data passes through that workstation throughout the everyday use of that machine doing business operation, is going to be subject to exfiltration. It's going to be constantly brought back from the server, from the workstation to the server controlled by the attacker. So nice diagrams and checklists are all good and all, but let's take a look at what this actually looks like with a short video. So here there are two things going on this screen in front of you. To the left is the user's workstation that is assumed to be compromised in some fashion. To the right is an attacker-controlled system. And I'm going to narrate as we look through this video. So first things first, the user is going to look through their files, see that everything is in order. They're very, very essential company data, as you can see, is going to, is in their documents, everything's going fine. Unfortunately, the attacker has some sort of executable running, some sort of script, and all of the data that is currently on their system is privy to the attacker over on the right. But that's not the full story. This is not a simple one-shot data breach. This is a constant exfiltration. And here the user is going to create new notes in the course of their daily duties in an encrypted form, because this is the unsecure version of this scenario. And that data is going to, once again, be visible to the attacker almost as soon as it was created and saved to the system. So what can we do about this sort of scenario? This is entirely transparent to the user in the way that they can't see it. Opaque in the fashion that they don't know what's going on. They receive no feedback, no stuttered operations on their system, no big flashing ransom notes saying their machine has been compromised. It is up to the organization, or several months later, the FBI, to realize that there is some sort of data breach going on. So how are we going to do that? Let's take a look at both of the architectures. So as I mentioned, both of these architectures are being built in tandem. And over the course, I know that we don't have time to delve too deeply into each of these scenarios, but if anyone has any further questions, I'm happy to expand further in the chat as I speak. So here we look at both architectures, which are being built simultaneously and in a way to demonstrate how they can work together. So these would actually be overlaid and combined, but for the sake of visual clarity, they are separate. That's also why we publish two guides, so it's more readable and easier to adopt and consider the different technologies you need and their benefits. So starting on the left, that's the identify and protect architecture that I discussed earlier. So highlighted in purple is the data protection capability. That's something that would have been very useful to have in this scenario. As I mentioned, all that data being thrown around was unencrypted. The simple cause of having the scenario of having a data breach with encrypted versus unencrypted data is very different. It's still, of course, a serious compromise and incident that needs to be reported, but it's much less, well, depending on your encryption, your organizational policies, but it's a much different scenario where you don't know that data is accessed, immediately available to an attacker. And in general, you're in a much better scenario, both from your organizational policies, your organizational standpoint, trusting your data and what happened, and your consumers' trust in you. Tying into that is that data management capability I talked about. In the case where something like this happens, you want to be aware of what data was where, but it also pays to not have an enterprise set up that single end user workstation has to be set up in a way that every single piece of data in your organization can be trusted in an unencrypted form on that. Being able to know where your essential data is and treat those machines accordingly. So that, of course, you don't want to have a scenario like this, but it's better to have a scenario where a setup in your organization where a single compromised laptop does not give privy to all your organization's data. It doesn't flow freely through every single end user's machine. And of course, at the end of the day, mitigation is very important here because we want to make sure that we have the ability to recognize what's going on and stop it. As data is moving around your enterprise and out of your enterprise, those are things that can create events through our logging tool. And once those events are recognized and brought to the attention of the security team, they'll have the tool to stop that data breach. So without further ado, let's move to our next use case, eavesdropping. In this case, the easiest way to visualize what's happening here is somebody walks into the lobby of your organization or a room, maybe a job interview, maybe someone working for another company in the building, maybe someone completely unaffiliated, plugs themselves into the wall or to the Wi-Fi and gains access to the network. This in itself does not immediately give them access to all the data that flows across the network, but it does give them the opportunity to conduct an attack. I'll demonstrate an ARP spoofing attack against the router that's going to let them put themselves in line between a user workstation and the company intranet. So anytime that employee uploads a sensitive file, maybe discussing some sort of intellectual property proposal, the attacker is going to be able to capture and view the file. Once again, the user is not going to be necessarily aware that anything went wrong. The attacker can simply look into and copy traffic and doesn't need to take it and run out the door giggling maniacally. They are able to do this in a way that they are not immediately detected. So let's take a look again at what this looks like. On the left, the user. On the right, some sort of attacker who has gained access to the network. The attacker is going to use the conveniently named ARP spoof tool to execute an ARP spoofing attack against the router. This is going to allow them to capture any network traffic that is flowing to and from the company intranet. They're going to open their tool here so that they're able to capture any traffic as it crosses the network. And over on the left, separately, the user is going to be uploading some sort of sensitive file to the company intranet. Put in a description for good record keeping, and so the attacker knows exactly what they're handling. And they will go on and upload a file. Once again, for the purposes of this demonstration, the file is unencrypted and the connection is not protected as well. And this will demonstrate exactly why that is a problem in this case, and why the sort of build architecture that we're going to recommend will have those sorts of protections. So here, the attacker is going to say, oh, hey, there's a nice network communication happening here, and they're able to view and download the file for their own use as they leave giggling maniacally out the door. So once again, our architectures are going to be able to interact with this at several stages. Our zero trust network protection tool is going to be very helpful in this scenario and is going to make it so that unauthorized network connections are simply disallowed. So for example, someone walks in, plugs their computer into the network. That computer is not supposed to be there. They are not authenticated as a user that has any sort of permissions on the network. They are not allowed to connect to things that they shouldn't, which in this case is nothing. So unless they have gone through a legitimate channel, they have no access at all. And even if they do gain access in some fashion, they're not able to access the entire network. So that's going to stop a lot of the capability for any sort of data breach to happen through an attack vector like that. Though once again, we are in a scenario where if this happens, it is completely unknown to the user and the security team unless they're looking for it. So that event detection tool, particularly looking at things moving across the network, movement of data and activities across the network, is going to be very important to recognizing that a data breach happened at all, and be able to take the steps to do anything about it. So I'm happy to answer questions in the chat about that as I move towards the last use case I'll be going into in-depth detail about today, which is ransomware. So we've talked about ransomware at RSA a few times before, but not as much through the lens of a data confidentiality attack. Previously, when we've used ransomware to test our architectures at the NCCOE, we've modeled it more after worm-like ransomwares, such as WannaCry and NotPetya, that seek to self-propagate and hit as many targets as possible. That is not the only flavor of ransomware that exists these days. Ransomware such as SolarNoKibi and Ryuk are examples of things that involve more attacker, involvement, more researched attacks, more awareness of the network they're attacking, more specific targeting of essential network resources, things like your backups, which would have been very useful if they weren't targeted by a ransomware attack. So we're going to see an example here where the attacker is much more involved in the ransomware attack. So what you'll see in the video I'm about to show you is a user is going to visit a site that resembles an organizational resource, in this case, the Office 365 Outlook window. And they're going to attempt to authenticate. They were misled to a site either through a phishing email or some other means of deception that's going to make it so that they are inputting their credentials, or in our case, administrator credentials, because that's more fun, into an attacker-controlled resource. Attacker will steal those credentials, and they'll be able to use that, and while gaining access to the network, to gain access to resources, download, and run ransomware. That ransomware is going to generate an encryption key, send it back to the home server. But there's a bit of a catch here, because the ransomware, in addition to whatever ransomware will do, is going to make the claim that files have been stolen. And let's take a look at what that looks like. So here, the victim is going to visit a phishing site, input the highest credentials they know, because it makes the demonstration a little more fun. And unfortunately, they are going to not realize what's happening because they're immediately redirected to the proper Outlook site, but their credentials were stolen by the attacker. They're able to log in, but at the same time, the attacker is going to be able to find their unencrypted and very secure ABCD1234 password, and use that in gaining access to the network. Once the user logs in as an employee or wherever they want to go, if they have an administrative password, they're going to call back to their server and start getting some resources they'd like to have. One of them will be ransomware, which they will then run. The other will be a ransom note. So in addition to any sort of destructive action happening from the ransomware, this is also a data breach, which is up to the organization. Well, it looks like in this case, the attacker is very willing to provide proof that a data breach has occurred. But it costs an attacker nothing to run ransomware, as it always would, not go through the trouble of stealing data and say, oh, by the way, I also stole your data. So even if you recover, I still want my Bitcoins, or otherwise I'm going to post it all over the internet. In this case, it's already posted all over the internet. But once again, we're in a scenario where it is on the organization to determine if a data breach occurred and the scope of it. And that is all on top of any sort of other destruction that came along with that ransomware attack. So in this case, robust reporting, logging, and monitoring tools are essential to determine, did a data breach occur, and to what extent did it occur, and then determining the steps going forward from there. In this case, it also would have been nice to have browser isolation tools in place to provide an additional layer of protection for users browsing the web, as well as if the web was an essential aspect of that use case in terms of bringing the ransomware down, then the browser isolation would have helped a lot in that scenario and made it so that a malicious executable, either through accident or intent, would have been able to be stopped. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that, but given time, I'd like to quickly go through the remaining use cases that we'll be using for these projects. We are looking at spear phishing, particularly as an attack vector, but also other destructive data breaches that can be executed through them, as well as some less malicious examples, where there's either a malicious employee or just simply mistaken employee. An accidental email where someone sends an essential file to the wrong person, either inside or outside the enterprise. A lost laptop, where you need to determine what data was on a system and what your next steps are. Privilege misuse, where someone gains credentials they shouldn't have and prints off files or exfiltrates to a USB drive and tries to walk out the door. These are all use cases that are good to consider when you think about your organization's data security. At the end of the day, any of these could happen, none of these could happen, something adjacent or completely unrelated could happen. But it pays to think through both the scenarios and the security technologies. And that's what we try to describe through our documents, to think about what you need in your organization to make sure your data is really secure. And with that, to discuss what you can take away from today's presentation, I am turning it back over to Anne.
Thank you, Michael. I hope with what we've been able to present here today, that next week, maybe you can start to think about some of these components and reassess your own organization's data security capabilities. It would also be great if you join the NCCOE Data Security Community of Interest. In our concluding slide, we have the email address on how to do that and how the website, but we really leverage our community of interest to help us identify what's the next big data security challenge that organizations would like us to focus on. In the first 3 months following this presentation, perhaps you'll be able to begin enacting steps to mitigate, accept, or otherwise deal with these types of risks that your organization may have. And perhaps it provides a better understanding what capabilities your organization's technologies are providing. And we're hoping you're able to understand what security controls may need to still be addressed within your organization. Within 6 months, you should begin to incorporate potentially some new capabilities to strengthen your own organization's ability to provide data security and perhaps develop a better response plan. Next slide, please. And so we hope that today we've provided some education that helps provide strategies for data security. We hope that you're able to learn how to understand these strategies and how you could apply it to your own organization. And then really, and that applying it to your own organization, bring back to your organization some new approaches to resolve data security challenges. Next slide, please. So to leave you with our contact information, that website link listed on this slide, that's where you can get a lot of the documentation that we have produced or discussed here today. I want to highlight that Bill Fisher, who is with NIST, he is our principal investigator for all data security programs. As well as there's his contact info, Michael's and mine as well. And then also, if you'd like to just reach out to the data security team, if you would like to join our COI, the data security team email address is listed there. And with that, I would just like to give a sincere thank you to everyone for joining us today.